Before we begin tonight's story, if you enjoy these deep dives into unsolved mysteries, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, share this video with fellow true crime enthusiasts, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us continue bringing you these carefully researched cases. Now, let's dim the lights and begin. In the quiet suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, during the late 1980s and early 1990s, families locked their doors at night with an extra sense of urgency. They checked on their children before bed with a lingering look, a touch that lasted just a moment longer than usual, because somewhere in those tree-lined streets, behind those neat brick homes with their manicured lawns, a predator was hunting, and he was unlike any criminal Victoria police had ever encountered. They would come to call him Mr. Cruel. The name itself sends a chill through anyone familiar with the case. It wasn't a nickname given by the media for dramatic effect. It was what he called himself. And over the course of 4 known attacks, he would prove that the name was horrifyingly accurate. This is a story about fear, real fear, the kind that settles over an entire city like fog. But it's also a story about something more unsettling. It's about how someone can commit terrible crimes, leave behind evidence, be seen, be heard, and yet vanish completely. It's about how sometimes the monster doesn't get caught, and decades later, he might still be out there. Let's go back to where it began. August 22nd, 1987, Lower Plenty, a quiet suburb in northeastern Melbourne, the kind of place where nothing much happens, where people know their neighbors, where children ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. It was a Saturday night. The family was home, a mother, a father, and their children. Around 7 p.m., they heard a knock at the door. Before anyone could answer, the door burst open. A man stood there, wearing a balaclava and holding a knife and a gun. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. Every movement was calculated, practiced, precise. He ordered the family to lie face down on the floor. His voice was calm, too calm. He spoke in almost a whisper, but it carried absolute authority. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, as if he'd rehearsed this moment many times before. He produced tape and rope from a bag. He bound the parents efficiently, professionally. Then he turned his attention to the children. He took an 11-year-old girl, led her away. The parents, bound and helpless, heard their daughter's terrified voice growing fainter. Then silence, the kind of silence that screams. 18 hours later, she was found. Dropped off at a park in Bayswater, miles from home. She was alive, but the trauma of what had happened would last forever. She'd been held captive, assaulted repeatedly, bathed meticulously to remove evidence, and then released. The level of planning was extraordinary. He'd worn gloves. He'd cleaned her. He'd even changed her clothes into ones he'd brought with him. But he'd made one mistake. Just one. He'd taken his balaclava off at some point. The girl had seen his face. She was able to provide a description to police sketch artists. A white male, possibly in his late 20s to early 30s. Light brown hair, a narrow face, thin lips. Nothing particularly distinctive. The kind of face that could belong to anyone. Police threw everything at the case. They conducted hundreds of interviews. They followed leads. They brought in psychological profilers. But weeks turned into months, and they were no closer to identifying the attacker. The sketch was circulated. Tips came in. None led anywhere. Then, just when the case was beginning to grow cold, he struck again. December 27th, 1988. More than a year had passed. Families had perhaps allowed themselves to relax, to believe it had been an isolated incident. They were wrong. This time it was Ringwood, another middle-class suburb, not far from Lower Plenty. Another family home, another Saturday night. The pattern was the same but refined. He'd learned from the first attack. This time he cut the phone lines before entering. This time he brought more equipment. Tape, rope, gloves, cleaning supplies, a change of clothes for his victim. He was more confident, more controlled. He entered the home around 11:30 p.m. Again, the family was ordered to lie down. Again, he bound the parents. This victim was slightly older, 13 years old. He took her, and for 18 hours, she disappeared into a nightmare. When she was released, her account was eerily similar to the first victim's. The meticulous bathing, the change of clothes, the calm, whispering voice. But this victim noticed something new. During the ordeal, she'd heard planes overhead. Not just one or two, but multiple planes, as if they were near an airport. She'd also noticed he played a radio, perhaps to mask any sounds. And she remembered he'd taken photographs of her. The crime wasn't just about the attack itself. He was documenting it, keeping trophies. The second attack galvanized the police investigation. This wasn't a one-time offender. This was a serial predator. The Victoria Police formed a special task force. They called it Operation Spectrum. Dozens of detectives were assigned. They began connecting the dots, looking for patterns, compiling data on every sex offender in the state. The psychological profile began to take shape. He was organized, extremely organized. This wasn't someone acting on impulse. He was selecting his targets carefully. He was surveilling homes, learning routines, planning every detail. He was likely employed, possibly in a position that required trust or allowed him access to homes. Maybe a tradesman, a delivery person, someone who could knock on a door without raising suspicion. He was also escalating. The time between attacks had shortened from 16 months to 13 months. If the pattern held, he would strike again soon. They were right. July 3, 1990. Canterbury, an upscale suburb. This time, the family was wealthier, the home larger, but the method was identical. Entry late at night, binding the family, taking a child. This victim was 10 years old. But this attack was different in one crucial way. This victim was held for much longer, 50 hours, more than 2 full days. And when she was released, her account added new, disturbing details to the profile. She described being held in a location that felt like it might be a house, but isolated. She heard no traffic, no neighbors. She mentioned that at one point, she was put in what felt like a car trunk and driven somewhere. The drive took about 25 minutes. Then she was brought into a different location, where she was again assaulted and photographed. She also noticed something significant. At one point, he spoke on the phone. He didn't say much, just a few words, but it suggested he might live with someone, or at least had to maintain some appearance of normalcy. His planning was so meticulous that he could disappear for 50 hours without anyone in his life questioning his absence. When she was finally released, he dropped her off near a major road, still with instructions to count to 100 before removing her blindfold. He was always thinking about his escape, always calculating the time he needed to disappear. 3 attacks, 3 victims, 3 families destroyed by fear, and still police had nothing concrete. They had the sketch, but it matched thousands of men in Melbourne. They had the profile, but it was almost too perfect. He didn't fit the typical pattern of sex offenders. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't disorganized. He didn't have a criminal record that would put him on their radar. The media coverage was intense. Newspapers ran the story on front pages. Television news led with updates every night. Parents across Melbourne were terrified. Some families moved out of the suburbs entirely. Others installed elaborate security systems. Children were no longer allowed to sleep in ground floor bedrooms. The fear was palpable, pervasive. And then, on April 13, 1991, Mr. Cruel made his most brazen move yet. And this time, it would end in tragedy. Templestowe, another northeastern suburb, another family home. But this attack was different from the start. It was a Saturday morning, not a Saturday night. Around 4 a.m., he broke in through a window. The family woke to find him standing over them, wearing his balaclava, holding his weapons. He bound the parents and the oldest daughter. But this time, there were 2 younger girls. One was 10 years old. The other was 13. He took them both into another room. And then, for reasons that remain unclear, he made a decision. He took only one of them, 13-year-old Carmine Shawn. He left the 10-year-old behind, still bound but unharmed. Then he disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness with Carmine. The family freed themselves and called police immediately. This time, there was no delay. Within minutes, police were at the scene. Within hours, a massive search was underway. Helicopters circled overhead. Search parties combed through bushland. Roadblocks were set up. Every available officer was mobilized. Days passed, then weeks. Unlike his previous victims, Carmine was not returned after 18 hours or even 50 hours. As time went on, the worst fear began to settle in. Something had gone wrong. Nearly a year later, on April 9, 1992, Carmine's body was discovered. She was found in a shallow grave in Thomastown, a northern suburb of Melbourne, not far from where she'd been taken. She'd been shot 3 times in the head. Execution style. The medical examiner estimated she'd been killed within a week of her abduction. The discovery devastated not just her family, but the entire city. Carmine's murder changed everything. Mr. Cruel was no longer just a kidnapper and rapist. He was a killer. The investigation intensified to an unprecedented level. But why had he killed Carmine when he'd released his previous victims? Theories abounded. Some investigators believed Carmine had fought back, had seen something she shouldn't have, or had somehow threatened to identify him. Others thought perhaps the intense police response had panicked him, made him feel that releasing her alive was too risky. Still others wondered if this had always been his plan, if he'd been building toward murder all along. The location where Carmine's body was found was significant. It was near a landfill in an industrial area. Not a place you'd stumble upon by accident. He knew the area. He'd chosen it deliberately. This suggested he had some connection to the northern suburbs, perhaps worked there or had worked there in the past. Forensic teams scoured the burial site. They found fiber evidence, soil samples, anything that might provide a clue. They compared it to evidence from the previous attacks. Some fibers matched. It was definitely the same offender, but they still couldn't identify him. The investigation expanded in every direction. Police looked at tradesmen who'd done work in the neighborhoods where attacks occurred. They investigated security alarm technicians, thinking he might have inside knowledge of home security systems. They looked at postal workers, delivery drivers, real estate agents, anyone who might have legitimate reasons to be in these suburbs, observing homes and families. They received thousands of tips. One particularly interesting lead came from a man who reported that his neighbor matched the description and had been acting strangely around the times of the attacks. Police investigated thoroughly. The man had alibis for most, but not all, of the attacks. They searched his home. They found nothing. He was eventually cleared. Another lead involved a teacher at a local school. He'd been seen near one of the attack sites. He matched the age and description. But again, after investigation, he was cleared. This happened dozens of times. Someone would seem promising, then would be eliminated from suspicion. The psychological profile was refined further. He was almost certainly employed in a stable job. He presented as normal, trustworthy, unremarkable. He likely had been committing other crimes before these attacks, building his skills, his confidence. The level of sophistication suggested this wasn't his first rodeo. Perhaps there had been break-ins, burglaries, voyeurism, crimes that escalated gradually toward violence. He was obsessed with control. The binding, the whispering voice, the meticulous cleaning, the careful timing of releases. Everything was about maintaining absolute control over his victims and the situation. He was probably someone who felt powerless in his everyday life, someone who used these crimes to feel dominant, important. He was also patient. The gaps between attacks showed he could control his urges, wait for the right opportunity. This wasn't someone acting on sudden impulse. He was planning months in advance, selecting targets carefully, watching, waiting. But despite this detailed profile, despite the massive investigation, despite the public attention and the substantial reward offered for information, Mr. Cruel remained a ghost. Over the years, several suspects were seriously investigated. One was a former military man who'd been stationed in the area and had the training to execute such organized attacks. but his DNA didn't match evidence from the crimes. Another was a security guard who'd worked at facilities near where victims had been held. Again cleared. In 1997, police announced they'd identified a new prime suspect. Media reports suggested they were close to an arrest, but nothing came of it. The suspect was never named, never charged. Later reports suggested this person had also been eliminated from the investigation. Then there were the copycat theories. Some investigators wondered if the later attacks might not have been committed by the same person. But forensic evidence suggested otherwise. The modus operandi was too similar, too specific. The fibers matched. The methodology matched. It was the same offender. Advances in DNA technology gave investigators new hope in the 2000s. Evidence from the attacks was retested using more sophisticated methods. They developed a DNA profile. It just didn't match anyone in the database. They ran it through national databases. Nothing. International databases. Nothing. Either Mr. Cruel had never been arrested for any crime, anywhere, or he was dead. The possibility that he died has been seriously considered. Perhaps he died by accident, by suicide, by natural causes shortly after Carmine's murder. This would explain why the attacks stopped so suddenly. It would explain why he's never been identified despite an intensive investigation spanning decades. But there's another possibility that keeps investigators and victims' families awake at night. The possibility that he's still alive. That he's been living among us all this time. Going to work, shopping at the grocery store, chatting with neighbors, hiding in plain sight. Some criminologists have suggested he might have moved away from Melbourne, perhaps even left Australia. Others think he might have been incarcerated for an unrelated crime, which would explain the cessation of attacks without requiring his death. Prison records have been searched, but the DNA doesn't match any known inmates. There's also been speculation about whether Mr. Cruel committed other crimes that were never linked to him. Were there earlier attacks before 1987 that fit a similar pattern but weren't connected? Were there attacks in other cities, other countries? The investigation has looked into unsolved cases across Australia and even internationally, but nothing definitive has emerged. Let's talk about the victims. The 3 survivors, now adults, have had to live with the trauma of these attacks for decades. By all accounts, they've shown remarkable strength. The families have largely stayed out of the public eye, trying to rebuild their lives away from the glare of media attention. They deserve privacy, dignity, and respect. Carmine's family has been more public, understandably seeking justice for their daughter. Her mother and father became advocates for victims' rights, working to improve how the justice system handles crimes against children. They established a foundation in Carmine's name. They've kept her memory alive, refusing to let her become just another statistic. The Carmine Chan case file remains open. Victoria police have never given up. Even now, decades later, there's a detective assigned to the case. Any new lead, any new tip, any advancement in forensic technology is immediately applied to the evidence. In 2010, there was renewed hope when police announced they were looking at several persons of interest. One was a man who'd been living in the area at the time and had since died. They exhumed his body to obtain DNA samples. The results were negative. He wasn't Mr. Cruel. In 2013, there were reports of a potential breakthrough involving a former teacher who'd lived near where Carmine's body was found. Again, the lead went nowhere. The pattern has repeated itself for more than 30 years. Hope, investigation, disappointment. The case has been featured on numerous true crime programs, both in Australia and internationally. Each time, there's a surge of new tips, new theories, new supposed sightings. Each time, investigators follow up diligently. Each time, nothing pans out. So where does that leave us? With questions. So many questions. Is Mr. Cruel still alive? If so, is he still in Melbourne? Did he ever commit other crimes? Was Carmine's murder always part of his plan? Or was it a panic deviation? Did he have accomplices? Did someone know what he was doing and keep silent? And perhaps the most haunting question, could he have been stopped sooner? This question has plagued the investigation from the beginning. After the first attack, Should police have done more? After the second, should there have been a more visible police presence in the suburbs? Should there have been public warnings, even at the risk of causing panic? It's easy to second-guess with hindsight, but these are the questions that torment the investigators who worked these cases. Some of them are retired now, but they still think about Mr. Cruel. They still wonder if they missed something, some small detail that could have cracked the case wide open. The truth is, Mr. Cruel was unlike anything they'd encountered before. He was organized, disciplined, patient. He thought like a criminal investigator, anticipating what police would look for and taking steps to counter it. He wore gloves. He bathed his victims to remove forensic evidence. He brought clothes to change them into. He chose locations carefully. He timed his attacks for maximum advantage. In many ways, he was the nightmare scenario. An intelligent, organized predator who understood forensic science and police procedure. The kind of criminal who appears in textbooks and training seminars as the most difficult to catch. Some experts who've studied the case believe he may have had law enforcement training or connections. The level of forensic awareness is unusual for the time period. In the late 1980s, DNA evidence was in its infancy. The general public wasn't widely aware of concepts like trace evidence or fiber transfer. But Mr. Cruel seemed to understand these things intimately. Others have suggested he might have had military experience. The calm under pressure, the planning, the operational security. These are all traits emphasized in military training. Several suspects over the years have had military backgrounds, but none have been definitively linked to the crimes. There's also been discussion about whether he might have been married or in a relationship. The fact that he could disappear for extended periods, sometimes days at a time, without arousing suspicion suggests he either lived alone or had a cover story that his partner accepted without question. Or perhaps his partner knew but said nothing. That possibility, as disturbing as it is, can't be entirely ruled out. The geographical pattern of the attacks has been analyzed extensively. All of the known attacks occurred in Melbourne's eastern and northeastern suburbs. Lower Plenty, Ringwood, Canterbury, Templestowe. These are all relatively affluent areas with similar demographics. Tree-lined streets, detached houses, families with children. This suggests he was familiar with these suburbs, comfortable operating there. He likely lived or worked in the general area. The disposal site for Carmine's body in Thomastown, north of the attack sites, broke the pattern slightly. This might indicate he had connections to the northern suburbs as well, or simply that he chose a location he felt was sufficiently remote and unlikely to be discovered quickly. Criminal profilers have noted that the escalation from release to murder is significant. Most serial offenders who kill do so from the beginning. The fact that Mr. Cruel released his first 3 victims alive suggests he initially didn't intend to kill. Something changed with Carmine. Understanding what changed might be the key to understanding who he is. Was it the heightened police response? The first 3 attacks, while serious, didn't generate the immediate massive police presence that Carmine's abduction did. Perhaps he felt cornered, felt he couldn't safely release her. Or perhaps Carmine fought back harder than the others, injured him in some way, saw something that identified him. We'll likely never know unless he's caught and chooses to talk. The reward for information leading to an arrest has grown over the years. At one point, it stood at $1 million. Despite this substantial incentive, no credible information has led to an identification. This again supports the theory that either he's dead, he left the country, or he's maintained such a low profile that no one who knows him suspects a thing. It's worth considering the impact this case has had beyond the immediate victims. An entire generation of Melburnians grew up with Mr. Cruel as a boogeyman. Parents became hypervigilant. The trust that allows children to play freely in their neighborhoods was shattered. Security systems became ubiquitous. The case changed how Australians thought about safety in their own homes. Some criminologists argue that Mr. Cruel influenced other offenders, providing a template for organized, planned attacks. Whether this is true is debatable, but the case certainly became a reference point in law enforcement training across Australia and internationally. The media coverage, particularly in the early 1990s, was intense and sometimes problematic. Some outlets sensationalized the case, publishing details that may have compromised the investigation or further traumatized victims. This led to changes in how Australian media reports on crimes involving children, with stricter guidelines about what can be published. Let's return to the central mystery. Who is Mr. Cruel? Based on everything we know, we can construct a probable picture. He's likely a white male, now in his 60s or 70s if he's still alive. He was probably in his late 20s to early 40s during the attacks. He's likely from Melbourne, probably the eastern or northeastern suburbs. He may have worked in a job that gave him access to homes or allowed him to observe families without suspicion. He may have had some training in forensics, law enforcement, or the military. He's disciplined, patient, organized. He's probably of average or above average intelligence. He likely has no criminal, or if he does, it's for minor offenses that wouldn't have flagged him as a violent predator. He may have committed other crimes, burglaries, or voyeurism that escalated to the attacks we know about. He's probably still in Australia, possibly still in Melbourne. He might be married, might have children of his own. He goes about his daily life, and no one suspects what he did more than 30 years ago. That's the profile. But a profile isn't a name. Profile isn't justice. The question that haunts everyone connected to this case is, will he ever be caught? Modern DNA technology offers some hope. Genetic genealogy, the technique used to catch the Golden State Killer in the United States, could potentially be applied here. If Mr. Cruel has any relatives who've submitted DNA to genealogy databases, he might be identifiable through familiar matching. Victoria Police have been exploring this avenue, but so far, nothing has come of it. There's also the possibility that he'll make a mistake. If he's still alive, he might commit another crime. He might tell someone what he did. He might develop dementia and confess. These are long shots, but they're possibilities. Or perhaps someone who knows him, who's suspected for years but said nothing, will finally come forward. Maybe someone who was married to him, who found something suspicious, who had doubts but never acted on them. Time has a way of loosening tongues. Deathbed confessions happen. Guilty consciences eventually demand relief. But as the years pass, the likelihood of solving the case diminishes. Witnesses die, memories fade, evidence degrades. The detectives who knew the case intimately retire or pass away, and institutional knowledge is lost. This is the cruel irony of cold cases. Time can bring new technology and new perspectives, but it also erodes the foundation of the investigation. For the victims and their families, the lack of resolution is a wound that never fully heals. The question of who did this, and whether he's still out there, remains an open wound. They've had to find ways to live with uncertainty, to build lives in the shadow of unanswered questions. Carmine's family, in particular, has shown remarkable strength. Rather than being consumed by bitterness, they've channeled their grief into advocacy. They've worked to improve support systems for crime victims. They've kept Carmine's memory alive not as a victim but as a person, a daughter, a sister, who had dreams and hopes and a life that was stolen from her. The three survivors have, by all accounts, rebuilt their lives with extraordinary courage. They've had to carry the trauma of what happened to them, but they haven't let it define them entirely. Their resilience is a testament to human strength in the face of horror. For law enforcement, Mr. Cruel represents the case that got away. Every detective who's worked on it has been haunted by it. Some have spent their entire careers hoping for a breakthrough. Some have retired still thinking about it, still wondering what they might have missed. This case is a reminder that sometimes, despite doing everything right, despite following every lead, despite using every resource available, the perpetrator still escapes. There are some who believe Mr. Cruel will never be caught, that he'll remain a mystery forever, that the case file will eventually be archived, gathering dust in some storage facility, a reminder of crimes that shocked a nation but ultimately went unsolved. But there are others, including many of the investigators who've worked the case, who refuse to give up hope, who believe that somewhere there's a piece of evidence that hasn't been properly analyzed, a witness who hasn't come forward, a technology that hasn't yet been applied. who believe that one day the phone will ring and the caller will have the information that finally cracks the case. As we move forward through time, as the 1980s and 1990s recede further into history, the Mr. Cruel case risks becoming just another true crime story. Just another unsolved mystery for people to speculate about on podcasts and forums. But we must remember that these weren't just crimes. They were devastating acts of violence against real children, real families. The pain is still real. The need for justice is still urgent. If you're listening to this and you're from Melbourne, particularly the eastern suburbs, think back to the late 1980s and early 1990s. Did you know someone who fit the description? Someone who worked odd hours, who had unexplained absences, who seemed overly interested in families with children. Someone who was just a bit off, but you couldn't quite put your finger on why? If you had suspicions at the time but dismissed them, now might be the time to reconsider. Even if you think it's a long shot, even if you're not sure, contact Victoria Police. They're still actively investigating. They still want to hear from you. One small piece of information, something that seemed insignificant 30 years ago, might be the key to solving this case. For those not from Melbourne, this case serves as a reminder of the monsters that sometimes walk among us. Not the obvious monsters, not the ones who stand out, but the ones who blend in. The ones who seem normal, unremarkable, trustworthy. The ones who understand that the best disguise is ordinariness. It's also a reminder of the importance of vigilance without paranoia. Yes, we need to protect our children, to be aware of dangers. But we also need to let them live, to play, to experience the freedom of childhood. Finding that balance is one of the great challenges of parenting in a world where predators exist. The Mr. Cruel case changed Australia. It changed how Australians think about safety, about trust, about the vulnerability of children. It led to changes in law enforcement practices, in media reporting guidelines, in how communities respond to threats against children. In that sense, something positive emerged from tragedy. But the central question remains unanswered. Who is Mr. Cruel? Where is he now? Is he still alive? Did he ever commit other crimes? Will he ever be caught? These questions have echoed through the decades, whispered in Melbourne suburbs, debated in police headquarters, discussed in true crime forums around the world. They're questions that demand answers, but answers that remain frustratingly out of reach. As I bring this story to a close, I want to acknowledge the victims once more. The 3 survivors who showed incredible courage both during their ordeals and in the years since. And Carmine Chon, whose life was cut tragically short, who should have had the chance to grow up, to pursue her dreams, to live a full life. She deserved better. They all deserved better. I also want to acknowledge the investigators, the ones who worked this case with dedication and professionalism, who followed every lead, who stayed up late reviewing evidence, who carried the weight of these crimes with them. They did their best. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, evil escapes unpunished. The case remains open. Victoria Police have never closed it, have never given up. Advances in technology continue to offer new possibilities. The hope persists that one day, perhaps soon, perhaps years from now, there will be a breakthrough. A name, an arrest, a trial, justice, finally, for the victims and their families. Until that day comes, Mr. Cruel remains what he's been for more than 3 decades. A ghost, a name without a face, a voice in the dark that still haunts the dreams of those who remember. A reminder that sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes they get away. But cold cases have been solved after longer periods. Technology continues to advance. People's consciences continue to work on them. Deathbed confessions happen. And so there's always hope, however faint, that the truth will eventually emerge from the shadows. If Mr. Cruel is still alive, if he's listening to this somewhere, know that people haven't forgotten. The victims haven't forgotten. The families haven't forgotten. The investigators haven't forgotten. Your crimes echo through the decades. The pain you caused continues, and the search for justice continues as well. For everyone else listening tonight, as you drift off to sleep with the sound of rain in the background, remember this story. Remember that behind every unsolved case are real people, real families, real pain. Remember that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Remember that cold cases can warm up. And remember that sometimes, speaking up, even decades later, can make all the difference. If you know something about these crimes, if you've ever had suspicions, if something about someone you knew back then never quite added up, please contact Victoria Police. You can do so anonymously. You might be the person who finally brings closure to these families. You might be the one who ensures that Mr. Cruel, whoever he is, finally faces justice for what he did. This is one of Australia's most notorious unsolved cases. It's a story of fear, of pain, of resilience, and of hope. Hope that someday, somehow, the truth will come to light. Hope that justice, even if long delayed, will eventually be served. Until then, the case remains open. The investigation continues. And somewhere out there, answers wait to be discovered. Thank you for listening tonight. If the story resonated with you, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. And if you have any information about these crimes, please don't hesitate to reach out to Victoria Police. Sometimes the smallest piece of information can solve a decades-old mystery. Sleep well, and remember, even in the darkest stories, there's always hope for justice. Story 2. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of America's most complex cold cases, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, share this video with others who appreciate deep investigative stories, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Your support truly makes a difference. Now let's turn down the lights and begin. On May 17, 2001, a 17-year-old girl named Alyssa Turney walked out of her high school in Phoenix, Arizona, on the last day of classes before summer break. She was excited. Her friends remember her being happy, talking about summer plans, about turning 18 in a few weeks, about finally having the freedom that comes with adulthood. She got into a vehicle and drove away, and she was never seen again. For years, her disappearance was treated as a runaway case. Just another teenager who decided to leave home, to strike out on her own, to escape whatever troubles she had. The police filed a report. Her stepfather gave interviews expressing his concern. Flyers were posted. Time passed. Life moved on. But Alyssa's younger sister, Sarah, never stopped believing there was more to the story. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that Alyssa hadn't run away, that someone knew exactly what had happened to her. And so Sarah began an investigation that would span 2 decades. An investigation that would uncover disturbing evidence, reveal a pattern of control and surveillance, and eventually lead to an arrest that shocked the nation. This is the story of what Sarah found. This is the story of Alyssa Turney. But to understand what happened on that May afternoon in 2001, we need to go back further. We need to understand the family dynamics, the history, the relationships that set the stage for tragedy. Alyssa Marie Turney was born on April 3, 1984. Her biological father was not in the picture. When she was 3 years old, her mother, Barbara Strong, married a man named Michael Turney. Michael was an electrician, former military, a man who presented himself as stable, reliable, a good provider. He adopted Alyssa, giving her his last name. Barbara and Michael had a daughter together in 1989. They named her Sarah. So Alyssa had a little sister, someone to look after, to bond with. The girls grew up in Phoenix, in a modest home in a working-class neighborhood. From the outside, they appeared to be a normal family. But inside the house, things were far from normal. Michael Turney was obsessed with control. He installed surveillance cameras throughout the house. Not just 1 or 2, but multiple cameras in nearly every room. He monitored the phone lines, recording conversations. He kept detailed logs of where everyone went, what they did, who they spoke to. He maintained an arsenal of weapons, far more than any civilian would need. He was particularly focused on Alyssa. As she grew into her teenage years, his behavior toward her became increasingly inappropriate. He would make comments about her appearance, her body, her clothes. He would follow her, show up unexpectedly when she was out with friends. He controlled who she could see, where she could go, what she could wear. Alyssa confided in friends that she felt uncomfortable around him. that something wasn't right, that she couldn't wait to turn 18 so she could leave. Some of her friends later said she'd mentioned being afraid of him, though she never went into specific details about why. Sarah was much younger and didn't understand the full extent of what was happening. She adored her big sister. Alyssa would protect her, spend time with her, make her feel safe. But Sarah could sense the tension in the house. She knew there were problems between Alyssa and their father. Then, in 2008, tragedy struck in a different way. Barbara Strum-Turney died. The official cause of death was ruled as complications from her cancer. But her death left Alyssa and Sarah alone with Michael. And for Alyssa, who had been counting the days until she could escape, the situation became more desperate. Friends noticed changes in Alyssa after her mother's death. She became quieter, more withdrawn. The light that had been in her eyes seemed dimmed. She talked more seriously about leaving, about getting out of the house as soon as she turned 18. Michael's behavior grew more controlling. He insisted on knowing where Alyssa was at all times. He would call her repeatedly when she was out. He'd interrogate her friends. He installed more cameras. The house felt like a prison. Alyssa made plans. She confided in a close friend that she was going to leave as soon as school ended. She was going to go to California, start fresh, get away from Michael. She just had to make it through the last few weeks of her junior year. And then came May 17, 2001. It was the last day of school before summer break. Alyssa went to Paradise Valley High School that morning. She attended some classes. Around midday, she called the school from a payphone and said she was sick and needed to leave. The school granted permission for her to go home early. Multiple students saw her in the parking lot getting into a vehicle. Some thought they saw Michael's car. Others weren't sure. But she left the school sometime around noon or early afternoon. She was supposed to meet friends that evening. They had plans to go to a local restaurant to celebrate the start of summer. Alyssa never showed up. When her friends called the house, Michael answered. He said Alyssa wasn't there. He said she'd run away to California with her boyfriend. The friends were confused. Alyssa didn't have a boyfriend that they knew of. And running away to California didn't sound like something she'd do without telling them, especially when they had plans that very night. Michael called the police the next day to report Alyssa missing. He told them she'd been planning to run away. He showed them a note, supposedly written by Alyssa, saying she was going to California and not to look for her. The handwriting looked like it might be Alyssa's, though some who knew her well said something about it seemed off. Police took the report but treated it as a low priority. Teenage runaways were common. The note seemed to explain her absence. Michael appeared cooperative, concerned. There was no obvious evidence of foul play. They filed the report and moved on to more pressing cases. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. There was no word from Alyssa, no phone calls, no letters, no social media activity. For a 17-year-old girl in 2001, this was unusual but not unheard of. Some runaways deliberately cut all contact with their old lives. Michael told people Alyssa had called once or twice but wouldn't say where she was. He maintained the story that she was in California, that she was okay, that she just wanted to be left alone. Some people believed him, others had doubts. Sarah was devastated. She was only 12 years old when her sister disappeared. She didn't fully understand what was happening. She missed Alyssa terribly. She kept expecting her to come home, to call, to send a letter. But nothing came. Michael's behavior after Alyssa's disappearance was strange. He cleaned out her room almost immediately, getting rid of her belongings, painting over the walls. When people asked about Alyssa, he would become angry, defensive. He discouraged Sarah from talking about her missing sister. He insisted that Alyssa was fine, that she'd chosen to leave, that they should all move on. But Sarah couldn't move on. As she grew older, as she began to understand more about the dynamics in their house, as she looked back on her childhood with adult eyes, she became increasingly convinced that something terrible had happened to Alyssa. And she began to suspect that Michael knew exactly what that something was. When Sarah turned 18, she moved out of Michael's house. She began distance between herself and the man who'd raised her. and she started asking questions. Hard questions. Questions that Michael didn't want to answer. She reached out to Alyssa's old friends. She compiled information about the days and weeks before Alyssa disappeared. She started looking through old family photos, videos, documents. And the more she discovered, the more disturbed she became. She found evidence of Michael's surveillance operation. She learned about the extent of his monitoring of Alyssa. She heard stories from friends about how uncomfortable Michael had made them feel. She pieced together a picture of a household where one person held absolute control and everyone else lived in fear. But Sarah needed more than suspicions. She needed evidence. She needed to understand what had really happened on May 17, 2001. And she needed to make sure that if Michael had done something to Alyssa, he would be held accountable. So she did something extraordinary. She became an investigator. She taught herself about criminal investigation techniques. She started a podcast called Voices for Justice, where she could share Alyssa's story and gather information. She reached out to journalists, to private investigators, to anyone who might be able to help. The podcast gained traction. People across the country began following Alyssa's case. They were moved by Sarah's determination, by her refusal to give up on her sister. Tips started coming in. People who'd known the family came forward with information. The cold case began to warm up. In 2008, police conducted a search of Michael Turney's property. This was 7 years after Alyssa's disappearance. The search was based on new information that had come to light, though the exact nature of that information wasn't made public at the time. What they found was disturbing. They discovered an extensive collection of weapons. Dozens of guns, explosives, bomb-making materials. They found surveillance equipment. They found Michael's detailed logs and recordings. And they found something else. Materials suggesting Michael had been planning something violent, possibly an attack on a police station or Union Hall. Michael was arrested, but not for Alyssa's disappearance. He was charged with possession of illegal weapons and materials. The judge denied bail, considering him a danger to the community. Michael would spend the next 8 years in prison on these charges. But the weapons charges weren't what Sarah was interested in. She wanted him charged with what she believed he'd done to Alyssa. She continued pushing, continued investigating, continued sharing information publicly. During this time, Sarah went through the evidence police had collected from Michael's house. She obtained copies of recordings he'd made, and what she heard on those recordings chilled her to the bone. Michael had recorded himself making disturbing statements. On one recording, he talked about Alyssa in ways that suggested an inappropriate obsession. On others, he made statements that could be interpreted as threats. He talked about having done things that could never be undone. The recordings were cryptic but deeply unsettling. Sarah also discovered something else. In the days before Alyssa disappeared, Michael had been behaving even more strangely than usual. He'd taken the last day of school off from work, which was unusual. He'd been preparing equipment, organizing materials, as if getting ready for something. And on the day Alyssa disappeared, Michael's work logs showed he'd called in to his employer using Alyssa's phone, claiming to be sick. But multiple people had seen Alyssa at school that morning looking perfectly healthy. The timing didn't add up. Sarah brought all of this to the attention of police. She organized it, presented it clearly, and made the case that Michael should be investigated more thoroughly for Alyssa's disappearance. She appeared on television programs, news shows, podcasts. She refused to let the case be forgotten. The media attention was intense. National news outlets picked up the story. True crime enthusiasts followed every development. The pressure on law enforcement to take another look at the case became enormous. In 2017, 16 years after Alyssa disappeared, police officially reclassified the case. It was no longer a runaway investigation. It was now a homicide investigation, and Michael Turney was the primary suspect. This was a major victory for Sarah, but it was also bittersweet. The reclassification meant police believed Alyssa was dead, that she hadn't run away to California, that she'd been murdered. It was confirmation of Sarah's worst fears. But a homicide investigation is very different from a runaway case. Resources were allocated. Detectives reviewed all the old evidence with fresh eyes. They conducted new interviews. They looked for physical evidence that might have been missed. The problem was that 17 years had passed. Memories had faded. Physical evidence had degraded. Witnesses had moved away. Some had died. Building a case that could result in a conviction would be extremely difficult. Michael, meanwhile, had been released from prison in 2017 after serving his sentence on the weapons charges. He denied any involvement in Alyssa's disappearance. He maintained his story that she'd run away. He refused to cooperate with the homicide investigation. He hired lawyers and stayed silent. Sarah continued her campaign. She appeared on national television shows, including Dr. Phil, where she confronted Michael indirectly through interviews. She maintained her podcast. She worked with investigators. She refused to give up. Then, in 2020, nearly 2 decades after Alyssa vanished, there was a breakthrough. On August 20th, 2020, Michael Roy Turney was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Alyssa Turney. The arrest came after a lengthy grand jury investigation that reviewed all the evidence, both old and new. The indictment didn't specify exactly how police believed Alyssa had been killed or where her body might be. That information wasn't made public, but the charges indicated that prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael had murdered his stepdaughter. The arrest made national headlines. Sarah, who had spent nearly half her life seeking justice for her sister, was vindicated. She'd been right all along. Alyssa hadn't run away. Something terrible had happened to her, and the person responsible was being held accountable. But the legal process was just beginning. Michael pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no body, no physical proof that Alyssa was even dead, let alone that Michael had killed her. They claimed the prosecution was relying on speculation and bias created by Sarah's media campaign. The case was complicated. Without a body, without a clear crime scene, without witnesses to an actual murder, the prosecution would have to build their case on circumstantial evidence. They would have to show motive, opportunity, and behavior that pointed unequivocally to guilt. Let's examine what evidence prosecutors had. First, there was Michael's behavior toward Alyssa. Multiple witnesses testified about his inappropriate attention to her, his controlling behavior, his surveillance of her. Friends testified that Alyssa had been uncomfortable around him and had been planning to leave as soon as she turned 18. Second, there was Michael's behavior on the day Alyssa disappeared. He'd taken the day off work, which was unusual. He'd been the last person seen with Alyssa, or at least the last person who admitted to being with her. His story about her running away to California with a boyfriend didn't match what anyone else knew about her life. Third, there was the note. Forensic analysis of the supposed runaway note raised questions. While the handwriting appeared similar to Alyssa's, some experts believed it might have been written under duress or possibly forged. The content of the note also seemed off to people who knew Alyssa well. Fourth, there were the recordings Michael had made. While none contained an explicit confession, they included statements that could be interpreted as admissions of having done something terrible. The cryptic nature of these statements could be seen as someone wrestling with guilt. Fifth, there was Michael's behavior after Alyssa's disappearance. The immediate cleaning out of her room, the disposal of her belongings, the anger when people asked about her, the discouragement of Sarah from discussing her missing sister. All of this suggested someone who wanted Alyssa forgotten as quickly as possible. Sixth, there was the complete absence of any evidence that Alyssa had ever made it to California or anywhere else. No ATM transactions, no credit card usage, no sightings that could be verified, no communication with friends or family. For a teenage girl in 2001, this level of disappearance was extremely unusual. Finally, there was the phone call to Michael's workplace on the morning Alyssa disappeared. Someone had called using Alyssa's phone, claiming to be sick. But Alyssa had been at school that morning. The prosecution argued this showed Michael was creating an alibi, a reason for Alyssa to have left school early. The defense countered each point. They argued that while Michael might have been controlling, that didn't make him a murderer. That Alyssa might have left school willingly for reasons unknown. That the note was genuine. That the recordings were being misinterpreted. That Michael's behavior after Alyssa's disappearance was that of a concerned but frustrated parent dealing with a runaway teenager, and that the absence of evidence of Alyssa being alive didn't prove she was dead. The case went through lengthy pretrial proceedings. COVID-19 pandemic delays pushed the trial date back multiple times. Legal arguments were made about what evidence could be admitted. Witnesses were deposed. The process dragged on for years. Sarah remained steadfast throughout. She attended every hearing. She continued her podcast. She kept Alyssa's story in the public eye. She became an advocate not just for her sister, but for other families dealing with missing loved ones. The trial finally began in 2023. It was highly publicized. Court watchers and true crime enthusiasts followed every development. Sarah was there every day, often wearing a shirt with Alyssa's picture on it, a constant reminder of who the case was really about. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They brought in witnesses who testified about Michael's behavior. They played portions of his recordings. They presented analysis of phone records and timelines. They built a circumstantial case that, piece by piece, pointed toward Michael's guilt. The defense challenged every element. They brought their own witnesses. They offered alternative explanations. They emphasized the lack of direct physical evidence. They argued that the prosecution was asking the jury to speculate, to fill in gaps, to assume rather than know. One of the most emotional moments came when Sarah herself testified. She spoke about her sister, about their relationship, about life in Michael's house. She described the surveillance, the control, the fear. She explained why she'd spent 2 decades pursuing this case. Her testimony was powerful, but the defense argued it was based on childhood memories and influenced by years of believing her father was guilty. The trial lasted weeks. Expert witnesses testified about handwriting, about behavior patterns, about timelines. The jury heard hours of recordings. They saw documents, photos, evidence collected over 2 decades. They were asked to piece together what had happened on May 17, 2001, based on fragments and implications rather than clear, direct proof. And then it was time for closing arguments. The prosecution argued that while they couldn't show the jury exactly how Alyssa died, they could show that Michael had the motive, opportunity, and means. They could show that his behavior before and after her disappearance was consistent with guilt. They could show that every piece of evidence pointed in one direction. And they could show that the only reason they didn't have Alyssa's body was because Michael had successfully hidden it. The defense countered that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That suspicion is not proof. That controlling behavior, while unpleasant, is not murder. That the prosecution was asking the jury to convict based on speculation, based on wanting to believe the emotional narrative Sarah had constructed, rather than on solid proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated. Days passed. The tension was unbearable. Sarah waited, as she'd been waiting for over 2 decades, for an answer, for justice, for closure. And then the verdict came in. Not guilty. Michael Roy Turney was acquitted of murdering Alyssa Turney. The courtroom erupted. Sarah was devastated. She'd spent half her life building this case. And in the end, it wasn't enough. The jury, despite hearing all the evidence, despite understanding the suspicions, decided that the prosecution hadn't met the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In interviews after the trial, jurors explained their reasoning. They found Michael's behavior disturbing. They believed Alyssa probably hadn't run away. Some even suspected Michael might have been involved. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. And without a body, without physical evidence, without witnesses, without a confession, they couldn't say beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael had committed murder. It was a crushing blow. But it's important to understand that an acquittal doesn't mean innocence was proven. It means guilt wasn't proven to the standard required for a criminal conviction. The question of what happened to Alyssa remains, in legal terms, unresolved. Sarah addressed the media after the verdict. She was heartbroken but not broken. She said she would continue fighting for Alyssa, that this wasn't the end, that she would keep searching for answers. Her strength in that moment was remarkable. Michael walked free. He gave no interviews, made no statements beyond expressing relief at the verdict. He returned to his life, whatever that life might be now. And Alyssa remains missing. Her body has never been found. Despite extensive searches, despite tips, despite decades of looking, she's never been located. Without remains, without physical evidence, the question of exactly what happened to her may never be fully answered. But the case isn't closed in the hearts and minds of those who followed it. Sarah continues her advocacy work. She uses her platform to help other families dealing with missing loved ones. She's turned her pain into purpose, her grief into action. The case raises important questions about the justice system, about what constitutes proof, about how we handle cases where someone vanishes without a trace. It's one thing to suspect, it's another to prove. And in a system where we rightfully demand proof beyond reasonable doubt, sometimes that means people we believe are guilty walk free. Some people are outraged by the verdict. They point to all the evidence, all the suspicious circumstances, all the signs that point toward Michael's guilt. They believe the jury got it wrong. They believe justice wasn't served. Others argue the jury made the right call based on what they were presented. That in America, we don't convict on suspicion. That it's better for guilty people to go free than for innocent people to be imprisoned. That the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt exists for good reason. Both perspectives have validity. It's the tension at the heart of our justice system. What we do know is this. Alyssa Turney disappeared on May 17, 2001. She was 17 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. She was planning to leave home, to start fresh, to escape a situation that made her uncomfortable. And she never got that chance. We know that Michael Turney exhibited controlling, inappropriate behavior toward her. We know he maintained extensive surveillance. We know his story about her running away doesn't match what people who knew her well believed she would do. We know that despite decades of searching, Alyssa has never been found. No confirmed sightings, no communication, no evidence she's alive anywhere in the world. And we know that Sarah Turney has spent more than 20 years refusing to let her sister be forgotten, refusing to accept easy answers, refusing to give up. The case has become famous in true crime circles. It's been covered extensively in podcasts, documentaries, television shows. It's become a symbol of both the power of personal advocacy and the limitations of the justice system. For those who believe Michael is guilty, the verdict is a tragedy. Justice denied. A murderer walking free. A family denied closure. For those who believe in the presumption of innocence and the requirement of proof, the verdict is the system working as intended. An acquittal based on reasonable doubt. The truth is probably more complicated than either extreme position. The truth is that we may never know with absolute certainty what happened on that May afternoon in 2001. But we can honor Alyssa's memory by not forgetting her, by continuing to ask questions, by supporting families dealing with missing loved ones, by advocating for changes that might prevent similar tragedies. Sarah has said that her fight isn't really about revenge or punishment. It's about truth, about making sure Alyssa is remembered as more than a missing person case number, about ensuring that her life mattered, that her disappearance matters, that justice, in whatever form it might take, is pursued relentlessly. This case is a reminder that closure isn't always clean.